Welcome to How Much Does It Cost? I'm Kelly TerWisscha, CEO and visionary of TWC Architecture and Construction. We've been in the veterinary industry since 2005, studying the industry from a design and construction perspective. And as you'll see in the segment coming up, we do more than design and construction. We actually know the industry. We know where the revenues are. We know where your expenses are. And ultimately, the answer to how much does it cost is it depends. Because the ultimate answer we want to work with you on is a return on your investment. By the end of this, you should have a good understanding of how to project your revenues, where your expenses are going to be, the definition of hard costs and soft costs of your project so that you include all of the costs associated of a project when you talk about how much does it cost. And then, does the project work? Is it financially feasible?
Okay, so I know that the topic is how much does it cost? In order to think about how much it costs, we really need to know what is the market potential for your practice. So in order to start there, we start with demographics. If you're a new practice or relocating to a new area, we need to study the demographics so that we can determine the market potential for your practice. So when you're looking at demographics, you have to think about what do you need to know? You need to know what your market is. If you're working in an urban environment or a more rural environment, you're going to have a different radius that your market potential will be within. If you're in New York City or Manhattan, your market potential might be looking at how many blocks radius from your practice. If you're out in the middle of Kansas or Minnesota, you might be talking about 25 miles. I've even talked to a doctor that his actual market potential was within 150 miles in a very rural area. So we need to look at that. We need to look at what the competitors are within your market. So you need to do a study of all of the competitors in the market. What are the full-time equivalents of each of those competitors? What services do they offer? So that you, as well as what services do you want to offer for your practice? So that we can do a real true comparison within the demographics that we're looking at. Another area of demographics that a lot of people don't think of is, are there any boundaries or extenuating circumstances that you might not be thinking about? Like a train track that runs through the middle of town, that's a very busy train line. That can be an extenuating circumstance that people don't want to have to cross, or I know in our local community, people don't want to have to go across the tracks because you never know what time you're going to get there. If you get stuck behind a train, you might be there for 15 minutes. Rivers, freeways, anything else that might be a barrier to people getting to your practice will have an impact. So we don't necessarily need to look at a perfect circle around your practice. We might have to change those boundaries a little bit when we're really looking at the overall market potential. So I'm going to show you a very rural area versus a Manhattan area. In a rural area, this happens to be around our home office. We looked at 10 to 20 to 30 miles as far as a realistic radius. And then in Manhattan, this is actually probably way too much. It's a half mile, a mile, and 3 miles. In reality, we're probably talking, if we're really studying that market, numbers of blocks instead of miles. So once we have that market, we want to look at how many households are within that market. Through our statistical data, we know how many visits, how many veterinary visits each household has, how many pets each household has, and ultimately we want to find out what the total number of veterinary visits are within a year within that market. So you can see in this instance, we're looking at 33,000 veterinary visits within the market. This is, again, rural area. And in this market, there was 17.5 full-time equivalent veterinarians. So the total market potential is 4.6 million. With the average per doctor, you're looking at only 265,000 per doctor within that market. Probably not a great market to be putting a new practice in. When we look at Manhattan, within the market area that we were looking at here, there's 42 full-time equivalent veterinarians. The total market potential, 48 million. and the average revenue per doctor, 1.15 million. And in Manhattan, that might not even be a good location for a practice, because when we talk about how much does it costs a lot more in Manhattan than it does in a rural community. Now we understand what the total market potential is for your practice. Now, if you happen to be an existing practice and you're just looking at relocating maybe across the street or a couple blocks away, we don't have to really study that market quite as much, because we have your history and we can look at what additional services you might offer in your new facility to establish what your market potential is. But once we have that, then we really need to start talking about how much does it cost. We're finally getting there. How much does it cost? When we're asked that question, it's a really open-ended question, because how much does what cost? There's a lot of different components that go into building a new veterinary practice. And we separate them into hard costs and soft costs. What most people usually are thinking when they ask us, how much does it cost? They're thinking about the hard costs. How much does the building cost? The things that are associated with hard costs, that are some items in there that you might not be thinking about as well. There's land acquisition cost. Obviously, you need to have property to put your practice on. On top of that, there's realtor fees, typically, if you're acquiring a piece of property. There's architecture, engineering, site development, construction. That's kind of the one that you're usually asking us about when you ask us how much does it cost. But as you'll see as we go through these numbers, it is a large component, but if you forget about all the rest of it, you're going to be missing a big part of your construction cost. Okay, and then equipment. You need to think about the equipment side, because obviously you're building a new practice. You can't be moving in a bunch of old equipment. You need to be practicing state-of-the-art medicine within your new facility. So we need to really take a look at what your equipment costs are going to be. So this is an example of where the hard costs were in a project. This is a real project that we did. You can see the site acquisition was a large number for this project, over $1 million on this project. $40,000 in landscaping, site work, $225,000. The biggest variable on any project when we're talking about construction costs is the site work component. If you have a level site, perfect soil conditions, everything is perfect, that number can be relatively small as it relates to the rest of the costs. Or if you have a site that needs a lot of soil corrections, might need piles for a foundation, we can get into a much higher site cost. So that's a large variable on any project. I would also make sure that before you're actually purchasing a site, make sure you talk to someone that knows construction and knows site work, because it can be a huge surprise after you've acquired a site. In this case, if you would have acquired this site for $1.1 million and it was built on an old gas station where there was fuel leakage and you have remediation that needs to be done, it could be a huge number that is an extremely negative surprise after you've acquired it. So you want to know that up front. What should your site work budget be for your project? Utilities can be a large variable as well. We've run into projects where we're having to run utilities a half a mile to get to the site. You want to make sure that before you acquire a site that you have utilities available and you know what your plan is for that. You can see this project was 5,500 square feet. We've budgeted $225 a square foot, probably more of a rural area for this project, for that budget. And then we've got canopies. A lot of times there might be a drop-off area or an undercover canopy for drop-off. We need to make sure that we budget for that. Signage, monument signage, whatever you're thinking about for signage for your facility. Architectural design and engineering, civil engineering, new and used equipment purchases, $250,000 in this project. That's a pretty standard number for equipment in a practice. So those are your hard costs. Now we get into the soft costs. These are the costs that a lot of veterinarians forget about when they're trying to think about a budget for their project. You have interim financing costs. That's a cost that a lot of times people forget about, and it can be fairly substantial. You'll see that when we get into the numbers on this project. Loan acquisition fees can be right up to 3% on a project. Again, that's a pretty good sized number. There's appraisals, there's utility hookup fees, taxes, sometimes there's impact city real estate fees, permits. Permits is a large variable. Rural area permits are usually not a huge issue, but you get into more urban areas and permits can be a substantial amount on a project. Insurance, during construction you need to insure builder's risk insurance, and closing fees. Another soft cost for a project that people don't think about is you need to have a construction contingency built into your project. Typically on a new project it's going to be 10%. Your lender is going to require that you have a contingency. Those are for unforeseen items that might come up during construction. During site work is really where your biggest contingencies might come into play. If you're looking at a renovation expansion type project, we might need more than 10% on that project, and that's something that we need to talk about up front. What are the potential unforeseens that we might have in this project? So we might be looking at a 15% contingency, all depending on what we're starting with from a renovation perspective. So now when we look at the real numbers on this project, our construction contingency, $159,000, obviously another number that you don't want to have forgotten about. That's in your soft costs. Preliminary planning, that's the work that you've done basically to get to the point where we would be at in this stage of the process. Loan prep fees, this project was 2.3%, $73,000 that, again, are soft costs that need to be a part of the overall project cost. Soil borings, not significant, but really needed. You need to know what's under the surface of the soil before we start to dig. Appraisals, title insurance, and then we get down to that interim financing. That's the interim financing that's during construction. As I talked about earlier, $66,000 on this project, something that most people just don't even think about until we start to lay out what is the true project cost and the true budget. Sewer and water access fees. This is an example of one of those local fees that can differ greatly depending on the project. In this case, $104,000 just to access the sewer and water for this project. Permits, $20,000. So if you take your hard costs and your soft costs, and again, we're talking the same project. Total project hard costs $3.17 million, soft costs $445,000. Again, when you're talking soft costs, if you forget about that number, that's $445,000 that you may not have been planning for if you didn't plan appropriately for the project. Total budget on this project, $3.6 million. Okay, a really important component anytime that you're thinking about building a project or renovating your current project is you need to understand your influence over the cost of your project and the timing of your influence over the cost of your project. So we have a graph that we call the cost influence curve. The axis on the left side is your ability to influence the cost of the project. Obviously, from the bottom of that is very low influence over the cost. The top is the high. And across the bottom is the continuum of time. So from today, when you're just thinking about doing a project, you have the highest influence over cost on your project. You could decide today you don't want to do anything. You've spent zero or whatever the cost was to get into the session. That's your total cost into your project. You had the most influence over your cost. From today forward, your influence over the cost of your project starts to diminish as you invest time and resources into your project. So as you get further into design, once you start to get into design, as you start to get site acquisition, that's a big bump in your influence over cost. When you actually acquire that site, that's a fixed cost onto your project, and you no longer have that influence. So once you get through design and once construction starts, your influence over the cost of your project is extremely low. You can see where that line kind of flattens out across the bottom throughout construction, because you've already established what your levels of finishes are, the size of your facility. Obviously to change the size of your facility during construction is going to be very, very expensive. So if you're going to make a decision at that point, it's going to cost you a lot. So keep that in mind. The time that you have the most influence over your project is today. And as you start to get into it and you start to invest time and resources into it, your influence is starting to diminish. So spend your time up front in the planning stages. Make your decisions in the planning stages. Make sure that everything is well thought out. Even as we start to get into talking about finishes, the earlier you can make those decisions, the better off you are. We're even starting to get into now with delays of material deliveries, equipment deliveries. We're seeing equipment that is 6 months out. So there might be some long lead time items that we may need to order even before we start construction in some cases. So you need to make those decisions early. The earlier you can make those decisions, the more seamless construction can be.
So the year before we did the build, it was about a 3% growth. After the build, it's been a steady 10 to 12% growth every year for the last 5 years. So it's helped business a lot.
Now we really need to get to the most important aspect of planning any project, and that is, does the project cash flow? Can you get financing for the project? And ultimately, is it worth your investment to do a project? So we're again staying on the same project that we were talking about before. Our total project cost, as you can see, $3.6 million. When we looked at our revenue forecast for this project had a boarding component in it as well. So we were adding $273,000 onto that roughly $1 million of veterinary service revenue for $1.27 million of total revenue. So we also have to look at what are the operating expenses going to be for your project. So we look at all of your operating expenses and project them out for your new facility. You're going to have all of your staffing expenses, accounting fees, bank service charges, your building expenses, your utilities, janitorial, gas, water, sewer, all of those operational type expenses. We also need to consider your own salary. You should deserve to get paid for the project. That's something that a lot of people think that their salary should just come out of the cash flow in the end. No, let's project that you're going to get paid something and the cash flow is gravy in the end. So we want to make sure that we establish what your salary should be and an appropriate salary for your practice. So now that we've looked at revenues and expenses, we need to take a look at where the cash flows are for this project. We project out 4 years when we do any cash flow projections for projects. And we're going to establish what a revenue growth factor is going to be for your practice as well. Right up, we're going to talk about that. It's going to depend on your market, what additional services you're offering, as well as we have to include inflationary factors on the expense side of the project costs as well. So when we're looking at the expenses, we need to have that inflationary factor included in so that we're not forgetting about that. So on this project, we were looking at year one, a cash flow of $86,000. Doesn't seem like a great cash flow year one, but ultimately we want to look at what is this project going to do in years 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then that will give us a guideline for what the future is going to look like. So you can see in year 2, we're starting to pick up where our cash flow is a little over $100,000. Now again, keep in mind, this is after you've paid yourself. This is not your salary. And then in years 3, we're getting we're getting a much better return on our investment. We're getting to $230,000 in year 4 is where we really start to pay off. We're at $550,000. And in this project, we were using a 20% growth factor annually and a 4% inflationary factor. This was a new doctor, actually a doctor in a new practice in her current geographical territory. So she's going to be able to pick up a lot of the current clients that she has and expand off from that. So ultimately, when we start talking about how much does it cost, these are the numbers we really want to focus in on. Not how much does it cost, but what's your return on your investment? How is the cash flow? Can you afford to do this project? What's your debt service ratio? Obviously, if your debt service ratio is lower than 1, you're losing money every year. The banks are not going to like that. Ultimately, they're not going to lend on that project. So if we get through this process and your cash flows aren't there, what do? Obviously, we have to change something in the project. We have to change, we can look at adding services if there's a possibility in your market to add services, reduce the size of the project. Occasionally, we'll find a market or a project that it just isn't feasible. And you want to know that up front, because again, on that cost influence curve, if you find out that early, you haven't expended very much money to find out that your project is just not feasible.
At these prices, the more paper you sell, the less money you'll make.
Our prices are the only thing keeping us in business.
They're actually putting you out of business.
Okay. Hold on. Ty, I would like you to crunch those numbers again.
It's programmed. There's no such thing
Just
as
crunch them. Just crunch them, please.
crunch.
Did it help?
Okay, so again, if the project is not feasible when we get through this process, we have to change the project. There's no button we can push that just automatically makes it work. We have to change aspects of the project. We can change the project size. We can add services, add grooming, boarding, different services that you can offer in order to make the project work. And again, sometimes it might not work. And now's the time to know that as well before you're well into the process. So since this is an on-demand session, we're not going to have Q&A, but we will go through some of the most common questions that we get asked. One of the questions that we get asked is, where should I start? Where do I start this process when I'm thinking about expanding or building a new facility? You need to start putting your project team together. And the most important aspect of that, as you could see from everything that we went through here today, you need to work with people that understand the industry. You need to have a lender on board early. You need to talk to an architect. And again, you want to be working with someone that understands this process, that can vet out the project feasibility very early in the process. You don't want to get well into design before you understand whether your project is feasible. So get that project team together, preferably before you acquire a site or before you sign a lease. And that actually gets us into another question that we get asked. Are we better off leasing or purchasing? And the answer to that question really is, it depends. The things that we look at for every instance is maybe the market. If you're in a very urban market where the cost of land is very expensive, maybe a long-term lease option makes sense in that scenario. If you're a startup practice, maybe a lease is a great option there, because you're not having to lay out all the capital to acquire the site. And then typically when we're in that scenario, we're figuring out, are we looking at a 5-year term here, a 7-year term? Because ultimately, if you're starting up a practice, probably your end goal is going to be building your own facility. And then if we know that timeline up front, we can design accordingly. If it's a 5-year plan, we're designing a facility for 5 to 7 years so that ultimately you're going to get out of that into a new facility and acquire land. So another a question on startups is, can you do demographics for a startup? And I would say that actually the demographics studies that we do are the most important for a startup, because you're going into a market that you're not currently in. So we need to really establish what is that market. Is it feasible for another doctor to be in that market? So absolutely, a startup, the demographics are important. Conversely, you might ask, if I'm in an existing market, are demographics important? I would say demographics are always going to help. I mean, even though you might know what your current revenues are and what your potential is, it's good for the lender to see that you've actually studied the market and you know where your position is within that market. You know what your percentage of that market is, and look at your potential within the market. There might be a huge untapped potential within your existing market that you're not seeing until you start to study the demographics. Another common question that we get asked is a timeline, or how early should I start planning? How early should I get into this planning process? A good rule of thumb that we would typically work within is, if you're thinking about building a year from today or starting a year from today, you might be a little bit late in your planning process. We'd like to have a year to a year and a half for the planning process before any construction starts. We can do it faster than that. But again, keep in mind that that cost curve and your influence over cost, the more time you have for that planning process, the better off you are. If we're in a real rushed process, you're probably going to make a couple mistakes in that process, and you want to be able to sleep on your design. You want to be able to think about moving into that floor plan and how is it going to operate, and you're going to make some changes throughout that process, and time will give you that opportunity.
As you can see, I'm a numbers guy. I love numbers. Numbers speak to me, and ultimately they need to speak to you as well. We study projects from a numbers perspective. That's how we have successful projects in the end, and we want all of our projects to be successful because we're in the industry. We've been in the industry for over 15 years, and we plan on being in the industry for the future as well. For any additional information, please contact me on the information below, and we'd love to touch base with you.